Part 1: The Forging of Iron Will, 1947 to 1965. The summer of 1947 arrived in Thal, Austria, not with celebration but with the quiet resignation of a defeated nation. 2 years had passed since the guns fell silent, yet the weight of war still pressed upon the Alpine village like morning fog that refused to lift. The Third Reich had crumbled, leaving behind a landscape of shattered dreams and empty stomachs. In this world of rationed bread and cold dust, in a modest gendarmerie station house that served as both police post and family home, Aurelia Schwarzenegger gave birth to her second son on July 30th. They named him Arnold Alois. The house on Thal's main road was a fortress of discipline. Gustav Schwarzenegger, Arnold's father, was a man carved from the old world, a former Wehrmacht soldier who had traded his military uniform for the crisp authority of an Austrian police chief's badge. The war had taken something from Gustav, as it had from all men who witnessed its horrors, and what remained was a rigid framework of order and control. He ruled his household as he ruled his jurisdiction, with an iron hand and an unwavering belief in the power of structure. Every morning at 6, the Schwarzenegger boys, Meinhard, 1 year Arnold Sr., and young Arnold himself, would wake to their father's commands echoing through the cold hallways. Gustav believed in physical excellence the way others believed in God. Perhaps it was his way of rebuilding what the war had destroyed, of creating strength where weakness had prevailed. Sunday mornings meant mandatory family hikes through the surrounding hills, regardless of weather. Rain, snow, or scorching heat, the Schwarzenegger boys marched. Gustav would time them, grade them, pit them against each other in impromptu competitions that turned brotherhood into rivalry. Meinhard was the favored son, the firstborn who seemed to embody everything Gustav valued. Arnold watched, measured himself against his brother's achievements, and learned the bitter taste of second place. The Austria of Arnold's youth was a nation trying to forget. The streets of nearby Graz still bore the scars of Allied bombing, buildings with missing facades, walls pockmarked by shrapnel, empty lots where homes once stood. Food remained scarce well into the 1950s. The Schwarzenegger family, like most, knew the arithmetic of deprivation: 1 egg divided among 4 people, watered-down milk, bread that was more air than grain. On special occasions, Aurelia would procure a piece of meat, and the dinner table would transform into a site of quiet celebration. These were the meals Arnold would remember, not for their abundance, but for their rarity. School in Thal was a one-room affair where children of all ages studied together, presided over by teachers who still remembered the old empire. Arnold was not a natural student. His mind wandered during mathematics and geography, drifting toward fantasies of escape and transformation. He was a restless child in a static world, a dreamer in a village where dreams had become dangerous luxuries. The other children noticed his difference, the way he stared too long at pictures in magazines, the intensity with which he approached playground competitions, the hunger in his eyes that had nothing to do with food. At age 10, Arnold discovered the image that would redirect his entire existence. His teacher, recognizing the boy's athletic inclination, suggested he join the local soccer team. Dutifully, Arnold reported to practice, but it was what happened off the field that changed everything. The team trained in a local gymnasium, and there, attached to the facility, was something Arnold had never encountered: a bodybuilding club. Through the grimy windows, he watched grown men lifting heavy iron plates, their muscles swelling and contracting in rhythms that seemed almost mystical. He pressed his face against the cold glass and witnessed transformation made physical, flesh becoming sculpture, weakness becoming strength. The men inside were members of the athletic union Graz, and they moved through their routines with religious devotion. Arnold couldn't look away. These weren't the broken men who shuffled through Thal's streets, carrying the weight of defeat in their shoulders. These were titans, modern-day gods who had taken control of their bodies in ways that seemed to defy the laws of post-war scarcity. Among them was Kurt Marno, a local bodybuilding champion whose physique Arnold would later describe as a revelation, the first real proof that the human body could be molded like clay, that genetics and circumstance weren't destiny. The gym became Arnold's obsession. At 13, he began training with a fanatical intensity that alarmed his mother and bemused his father. Gustav didn't object. At least the boy was building discipline, but he couldn't comprehend the fervor. Arnold would disappear into the basement of their home, where he fashioned crude weights from whatever materials he could scavenge: metal bars, cement blocks, old farming equipment. The basement became his laboratory, his sanctuary, the only place where the hierarchy of his family home inverted. Down there, among the dust and makeshift iron, Arnold wasn't the second son. He was becoming something else entirely. His bedroom walls told the story of his transformation. Where other teenagers might have hung pictures of movie stars or sports heroes, Arnold plastered every available surface with images of bodybuilders. Reg Park, the British strongman who had transitioned to playing Hercules in Italian sword and sandal films, became his primary fixation. Park represented the bridge Arnold was desperate to cross, from the Iron Temple to the silver screen, from obscurity to immortality. Arnold would stare at Park's 20-inch arms, his barrel chest, his confident smile, and project himself into that frame. If a working-class Englishman could become Hercules, why not a policeman's son from Thal? The problem was Austria itself. The country offered no path from bodybuilding to anything resembling the life Arnold envisioned. In 1960s Austria, bodybuilding was a fringe pursuit, viewed with suspicion by mainstream society. There were no sponsorships, no professional circuits, no way to transform muscle into money or fame. The sport existed in the shadows, practiced by men who did it for love or madness, never for profit. Arnold understood, even at 14, that his dreams were too large for Austrian soil. He would have to leave, but leaving required resources, and resources required success in the only arena available to him: bodybuilding competitions. At 15, Arnold was already training 6 days a week, often twice a day. His commitment bordered on the pathological. He would ride his bicycle 13 kilometers to the gym in Graz, train for hours, then cycle home in darkness, his muscles screaming, his mind already planning the next day's assault. His schoolwork suffered. His social life became non-existent. The other boys his age were discovering girls and beer. Arnold was discovering the brutal calculus of hypertrophy, the precise relationship between weight, repetition, and rest that produced muscle growth. His mother worried. Aurelia was a gentle woman, warm in ways that balanced Gustav's severity, and she watched her younger son disappear into his obsession with growing concern. She would prepare extra portions of food when she could afford it, understanding that Arnold's body was consuming fuel at rates that outpaced the family's modest means. She never fully understood his dreams. How could she, having never traveled beyond Austria's borders? But she recognized the steel in his determination. It was the same steel she'd seen in Gustav during the war years, but pointed toward construction rather than destruction. Gustav's reaction was more complex. He saw Arnold's dedication and approved of the discipline, but he wanted practical results. "All this training," he would say. "But for what? To pose on a stage in your underwear?" He pushed Arnold toward conventional athletics, toward soccer or track, pursuits with clear career trajectories. But Arnold had seen beyond the horizon of conventional success. He had found, in the pages of bodybuilding magazines smuggled into Austria from America, evidence of a different world, a place where muscle was currency, where the body could be both art and commodity. The magazines arrived regularly, passed hand to hand among the Graz bodybuilding community like contraband. They came from a place Arnold could barely imagine, California, a land of endless sunshine where men with names like Dave Draper and Larry Scott trained year-round in outdoor gyms, building physiques that made even the European champions look ordinary. The photographs showed a different universe, one where bodybuilders drove expensive cars, dated beautiful women, and lived lives of glamorous excess. Arnold studied these images with the intensity of a monk studying scripture, memorizing every detail, internalizing every pose. By 17, Arnold stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed 220 pounds of muscle. He had transformed his body through sheer will, training through sickness, through injury, through the doubt and derision of everyone around him except his small circle of fellow iron addicts. He had become the best young bodybuilder in Thal, then in Graz, then in all of Styria. But Austria remained too small, its competitions too amateur, its prizes too meager. He needed a larger stage, and that stage existed in Munich, Germany, where Kurt Marnell had relocated to train with other serious athletes. The decision to leave came in 1965. Arnold was 18, legally able to make his own choices, but the weight of family expectation pressed heavily. Gustav wanted him to follow a stable path, finish his education, join the military, perhaps enter civil service. Aurelia simply wanted him close. Meinhard had already begun drinking heavily, showing signs of the demons that would eventually consume him. The family was fracturing, and Arnold's departure would accelerate the process. But staying meant death, not physical death, but the death of the enormous, impossible dream that had sustained him through years of cold basements and aching muscles. He left on a gray morning in October, carrying a single bag of belongings and enough money for a one-way train ticket to Munich. As the train pulled away from Graz station, Arnold pressed his face against the window and watched Austria recede. He didn't look back with nostalgia. The country of his birth had given him hunger, discipline, and an unshakable belief in the power of transformation. Now he was heading toward the forge where that transformation would be completed. He was 18 years old. He spoke minimal German and no English. He had no real plan beyond getting bigger and stronger, and he was absolutely certain of his destiny. The boy from Thal was dead. What rode that train toward Munich was something new, a machine of ambition wrapped in muscle, powered by a refusal to accept the limitations of birth and circumstance. Arnold Alois Schwarzenegger was about to become simply Arnold, and the world wasn't ready for what that meant. Part 2, The Munich Crucible, 1965 to 1968. Munich hit Arnold like a physical blow. The city was alive in ways that Thal could never comprehend, a roaring metropolis of 1 million souls, rebuilt from rubble into a showcase of West German economic miracle. The Wirtschaftswunder had transformed the city into a testament to capitalist resurrection. Where Graz had been provincial and sleepy, Munich pulsed with commerce, culture, and possibility. Neon signs advertised products Arnold had only seen in magazines. Cars, Mercedes, BMWs, Volkswagens, clogged streets that had been cleared of debris less than 2 decades earlier. The cafes were full, the shops overflowed with goods, and everywhere Arnold looked, he saw evidence of a nation that had chosen to forget its past by building furiously toward its future. He arrived with an address scrawled on paper: the Athletic Union Gym on Schillerstrasse, where Kurt Arnold trained. The gym occupied the basement of a commercial building, accessible only through a narrow stairwell that descended into what felt like an underworld temple. Arnold pushed open the heavy door and was met with a wall of sound and smell, iron clanging against iron, men grunting through repetitions, the thick musk of sweat and liniment oil. The ceiling was low, the lighting poor, the equipment crude by modern standards. But to Arnold, stepping into that room was like entering Valhalla. The men training there were serious beyond anything he'd encountered in Austria. These weren't hobbyists or weekend warriors. They were bodybuilders who had organized their entire lives around the accumulation of muscle mass. They trained twice daily, ate according to strict protocols, and measured their progress in fractions of inches. Marnell introduced Arnold to the hierarchy. There was Reinhard Smilana, a German champion with arms that stretched his shirt sleeves to their structural limits. There was Franco Columbu, a Sardinian immigrant barely 5 feet 5 inches tall but built like a compressed spring, all dense muscle and explosive power. And there was Rolf Putziger, whose back development had won him national recognition and whose intensity in the gym bordered on frightening. Arnold found work immediately. He had to eat. Taking a job at a gym on Schwanthelerstrasse, cleaning equipment, and managing the facility in exchange for room and board plus a small salary. The arrangement was medieval. He slept in a small room behind the gym office, showered in the facility's locker room, and took most of his meals at a nearby Gasthaus where the owner had agreed to feed him at cost. His possessions fit in a single locker. His world contracted to a triangle: sleep, train, work. Everything else was stripped away as unnecessary weight. The training protocols in Munich were savage. Under Marnell's guidance, Arnold adopted a routine that would have broken most men. He woke at 5 in the morning for his first training session, 2 hours of heavy compound movements, squats and deadlifts and bench presses that left him shaking. After work, he returned for the evening session, another 2 hours focused on isolation exercises, sculpting individual muscle groups with the precision of a jeweler cutting diamonds. He consumed food mechanically, viewing it purely as fuel: eggs by the dozen, chicken breasts by the pound, protein powder mixed with whole milk until the shake was thick as cement. But Munich presented a problem Arnold hadn't anticipated: the Austrian military. Conscription was mandatory for Austrian men at age 18, and Arnold had left the country without fulfilling his service obligation. The Austrian government tracked him down within 3 months. In January 1966, at age 18, Arnold was ordered to report to the Austrian army base in Graz for his mandatory 1-year service. The timing couldn't have been worse. He was scheduled to compete in the Junior Mr. Europe competition in Stuttgart that October, the biggest competition of his young career. Military service would derail everything. Arnold reported to the barracks in Graz with rage in his heart. The Austrian military in 1966 was a peacetime institution, more concerned with bureaucracy than combat readiness. The days were filled with marching drills, weapons maintenance, and the mindless protocols of military life. For Arnold, it was torture. Hours of standing at attention, days without touching a weight, his carefully constructed physique beginning to soften. He could feel the muscle atrophying, the momentum dissipating. The other conscripts thought he was insane, watching him do push-ups and sit-ups in the barracks long after lights out, performing squats with other soldiers sitting on his shoulders. The base had a small gym, barely equipped, but Arnold colonized it. He bullied the commanding officer into letting him use it during off hours, arguing that physical fitness served military readiness. What he didn't mention was that he was planning something far more serious: desertion. The Junior Mr. Europe competition was scheduled for October 30th, 1966. Arnold would still be serving his military obligation. The penalty for going AWOL was severe: military prison, possibly criminal charges. But Arnold had done the calculation. Missing the competition meant remaining unknown, trapped in Austria's limited bodybuilding scene. Competing meant potential victory, recognition, and a path toward the larger world. The choice was obvious. He escaped the base on October 28th, simply walking off during a routine exercise, catching a train to Stuttgart. For 2 days, Arnold was a fugitive, a deserter competing in an international bodybuilding competition, while Austrian military police presumably searched for him. The irony was perfect. Here was a soldier who had gone AWOL not to avoid combat but to flex shirtless on a stage. The competition itself was a revelation. Arnold, at 19, was the youngest competitor by years, and he destroyed the field. His proportions, his size, his confidence, everything exceeded what European judges expected from a teenager. When they called his name as champion, Arnold stood on that stage understanding that every risk had been justified. He returned to the base voluntarily 2 days later, ready to face military prison. But something unexpected happened. His commanding officer, upon hearing that Arnold had won an international championship for Austria, didn't punish him. Instead, the military brass saw propaganda value. Here was proof of Austrian excellence, a story of national pride during the Cold War, when East and West competed through sports as much as through weapons. They gave Arnold a reprimand, then quietly arranged for him to train more freely on base, even allowing him to compete in other competitions while technically still in uniform. The Austrian military had discovered, accidentally, that Arnold Schwarzenegger was more valuable as a symbol than as a soldier. His service ended in September 1967. Arnold walked out of the barracks and returned to Munich a different man, harder, more calculating, willing to break any rule that stood between him and his goals. The military had taught him that systems could be manipulated, that authority figures would bend when confronted with results, that the world rewarded winners and forgot rule followers. These were lessons he would apply ruthlessly for the rest of his life. Back in Munich, Arnold received news that changed everything. Reg Park, his childhood hero, wanted to meet him. Park had heard about the young Austrian who was dominating European competitions and had contacted Arnold to arrange a meeting. For Arnold, this was like a religious experience. The man whose posters had covered his bedroom walls was coming to see him train. When Park arrived at the Schillerstrasse gym in October 1967, Arnold was so nervous he could barely complete his warm-up sets. Park was 40 years old, past his competitive prime but still massive, still carrying the aura of a champion. He watched Arnold train for 2 hours, saying nothing, his eyes measuring and calculating. Afterward, over coffee at a nearby cafe, Park spoke with brutal honesty. "You have the genetics," he told Arnold. "You have the work ethic. But you're training in the wrong place. Europe is too small. The real bodybuilding world is in America, specifically California. That's where the money is, where the competitions matter, where the magazines are published. If you want to be the best, you have to go there. Arnold listened with the intensity of a student receiving gospel. Park explained the economics of American bodybuilding, how champions earn money through gym ownership, seminars, endorsements, and film work. He described Gold's Gym in Venice Beach, where the world's best bodybuilders trained under perfect weather year-round. He painted a picture of a bodybuilding ecosystem that actually sustained its participants, where muscle could be converted into livelihood. But here's the thing, Park warned. You can't just show up. You need to win the Mr. Universe first. That's your ticket. Win that, and the doors to America open. The Mr. Universe competition was scheduled for September 1968 in London. Arnold had exactly 11 months to prepare. He threw himself into training with renewed savagery, but now there was a strategic element to his madness. He studied the previous winners, analyzing their physiques for weaknesses and strengths. He realized that European bodybuilders, while large, lacked the complete development of the top Americans. Their legs were often underdeveloped, their posing less dramatic. Arnold began training his legs with a fury that left him limping, adding quad sweeps and hamstring thickness that most Europeans ignored. He practiced posing for hours, understanding that bodybuilding was theater as much as sport. Money remained his constant problem. Working at the gym provided subsistence but nothing more. He ate cheap cuts of meat, the protein sources that other Germans ignored, organ meats, chicken backs, the grotty bits that cost pennies. Franco Columbu, who had become Arnold's closest friend and training partner, was equally impoverished. The two of them would pool their resources, cooking enormous pots of food that they'd portion out for the week. They spoke broken German to each other, Franco's Italian inflected, Arnold's Austrian tinged, and dreamed in a language that needed no translation: California, America, success. The friendship between Arnold and Franco was alchemical. Where Arnold was tall and smooth-muscled, Franco was compact and granite-hard. Where Arnold was gregarious and charming, Franco was quiet and intense. They pushed each other past reasonable limits, competing over everything: who could lift more, who could eat more, who could endure more pain. Their training sessions became legendary in the Munich bodybuilding community. Two young immigrants destroying their bodies in pursuit of dreams that seemed, to everyone else, completely insane. As the Mr. Universe approached, Arnold began to feel something he never experienced before: certainty. Not confidence, he'd always had that, but a bone-deep knowledge that he was about to win. His body had responded to the year of preparation like a machine receiving perfect programming. At 21 years old, he weighed 240 pounds with body fat in the single digits. His arms measured 22 inches cold. His chest spanned nearly 60 inches. When he looked in the mirror, he no longer saw the police chief's son from Thal. He saw what he'd been building towards since that first glimpse through the gym window at age 10, a champion. London in September 1968 was cool and damp, the sky perpetually threatening rain. The Mr. Universe competition was held at the Victoria Palace Theatre, a grand venue that gave the event a legitimacy bodybuilding rarely enjoyed. Backstage, Arnold encountered the men he'd only seen in magazines: Chet Yorton, the previous year's champion; Dennis Tenorino, an American with perfect proportions; Frank Zane, whose aesthetic physique represented a different approach to the sport. They were professionals, experienced competitors who knew how to peak, how to pose, how to work the judges. Arnold was the outsider, the unknown European kid. When his name was called for the comparison round, Arnold walked onto that London stage and executed something that was part athletic performance, part psychological warfare. He hit his poses with theatrical flair, holding them longer than necessary, making eye contact with judges, commanding attention through sheer force of personality. His body was huge but aesthetic, powerful but proportional. The British audience, accustomed to the more reserved European style, didn't know how to react to this brash Austrian who posed like he'd already won. The judges deliberated for what felt like hours. When they announced Arnold Schwarzenegger as the new Mr. Universe, Amateur Division, the 21-year-old from Thal stood under the spotlights and understood that his life had just changed irrevocably. He had the credential, the title, the proof of excellence that would serve as his visa to America. Reg Park found him afterward, shook his hand, and said simply, "Now you're ready." Arnold flew back to Munich with a trophy and a plan. California was waiting. The real war, the one that would determine whether he became a footnote or a legend, was about to begin. Part 3: California Dreaming and Iron Reality, 1968 to 1975. Arnold Schwarzenegger stepped off the plane at Los Angeles International Airport on October 1, 1968, carrying 2 suitcases and speaking approximately 200 words of English. The California sun hit him like a physical force, not the pale, tentative sunshine of Munich or the alpine brightness of Austria, but an aggressive, consuming heat that seemed to radiate from the concrete itself. Palm trees lined the boulevard outside the terminal, their improbable silhouettes confirming what Arnold had only half believed. He had actually made it to America. Joe Weider was waiting at arrivals. The 48-year-old Canadian publisher of muscle magazines was bodybuilding's primary kingmaker, the man who controlled the sport's economic ecosystem through his publishing empire and supplement company. Weider had been watching Arnold's progress through European competition results, seeing in the young Austrian exactly what the American bodybuilding scene needed: size, charisma, and an immigrant hunger that made native-born champions look complacent. He had arranged Arnold's visa, sponsoring him as an athlete and employee of Weider Barbell Company. In exchange, Arnold would train, compete, promote Weider's products, and transform himself into the face of modern bodybuilding. The deal Weider offered was simultaneously generous and exploitative: $100 per week, an apartment in Santa Monica, and unlimited access to the gym. By any objective measure, it was poverty wages. But for Arnold, coming from a country where bodybuilders earned nothing, where the sport existed in basement gyms and generated zero income, it was a miracle. Someone was actually paying him to build muscle. The American dream, he was discovering, had a very specific dollar amount attached to it. Weider drove Arnold directly to the apartment on 4th Street in Santa Monica, a modest unit in a building full of other Weider-sponsored athletes. The furniture was basic, the kitchen barely functional, but through the window Arnold could see the Pacific Ocean, an expanse of water so vast it made the lakes of Austria look like puddles. That night, unable to sleep due to jet lag and excitement, Arnold walked to the beach and stood in the sand, feeling the warm October air on his skin. In Munich, October meant the beginning of cold. Here, people were swimming at night. The absurdity and wonder of California's climate struck him as almost offensive. How could anyone fail to succeed in a place where winter didn't exist? Gold's Gym was a 20-minute walk from Arnold's apartment, located on Pacific Avenue in Venice Beach. The gym had opened earlier that year, founded by Joe Gold, a former merchant marine who had built the equipment himself in a backyard workshop. From the outside it looked like a warehouse, which is exactly what it was, a converted parking garage with enormous windows that Gold had installed to let in natural light. Inside, it was a cathedral of iron. The equipment was crude but effective: squat racks welded from steel pipe, benches covered in cracked vinyl, dumbbells that went up to weights most commercial gyms wouldn't stock. The walls were bare brick, the floor was concrete, and the air conditioning was non-existent. When Arnold walked in on his second day in America, he knew immediately he had found his home. The men training at Gold's were unlike anyone Arnold had encountered in Europe. There was Dave Draper, the blonde bomber, whose arms and chest had made him a magazine cover staple. There was Frank Zane, studying for a teaching credential while maintaining a physique of classical proportions. There was Sergio Oliva, the myth, a Cuban defector whose genetics seemed to violate the known laws of muscle development. His arms appeared to grow directly out of his torso, bypassing normal shoulder architecture entirely. And there was Bill Pearl, still training at 40, a living legend who had won the Mr. Universe title multiple times. Arnold's arrival created immediate tension. He was the new champion, the European invader, and the Venice Beach regulars didn't automatically accept his credentials. The first week, he trained quietly, learning the gym's rhythms and hierarchies. But Arnold wasn't built for quiet. By the second week, he was holding court between sets, telling stories in his fractured English, laughing too loud, taking up space with the confidence of someone who had already decided he would own this place. Some of the Americans found him arrogant. Others found him refreshing. Here was someone who actually believed bodybuilding mattered, who treated it with the seriousness of a religion rather than a hobby. The language barrier was Arnold's most immediate obstacle. His English was functional for gym communication. Spot me one more rep. Heavy weight, but completely inadequate for everything else. Ordering food at restaurants became an adventure and miscommunication. Dealing with bureaucracy was nightmarish. Women, who seemed extraordinarily forward by Austrian standards, flirted in idioms Arnold couldn't decode. He enrolled in English classes at Santa Monica College, sitting in classrooms with teenage immigrants, conjugating verbs and memorizing vocabulary. But his real education came from television. Arnold became addicted to American television with the fervor he brought to everything. He watched game shows, sitcoms, news programs, and commercials, absorbing not just words but rhythm, humor, and cultural reference points. He realized quickly that American English wasn't just about vocabulary, it was about timing, about knowing when to pause, when to emphasize, when to deploy humor. He studied Johnny Carson the way he studied bodybuilding technique, breaking down the mechanics of Carson's monologues, understanding how a joke was constructed. The Austrian accent, which he initially tried to eliminate, he eventually recognized as an asset. It made him distinctive, memorable, an exotic presence in a country that consumed exoticism as entertainment. The 1969 Mr. Olympia was scheduled for September in New York City. This was the championship that mattered, the title that separated professionals from amateurs. Arnold had been in America less than a year, but Weider had been promoting him relentlessly through the muscle magazines, building him into a challenger before he'd even competed. The reigning champion was Sergio Oliva, widely considered unbeatable. Oliva's physique was freakish in the most literal sense. His muscle bellies were longer, his insertions more favorable, his proportions more extreme than any bodybuilder in history. He had won the Olympia in 1967 and 1968, and most observers assumed he'd win it forever. Arnold studied Oliva with the cold calculation of a general analyzing an enemy. Oliva's strengths were obvious: arms, back, and legs of unprecedented size. But Arnold identified weaknesses too. Oliva's midsection was blocky, his posing sometimes awkward, and his presentation lacked theatrical polish. Arnold couldn't outmass Oliva, but he could outpresent him. He spent months refining his posing routine, choreographing every transition, planning every facial expression. Bodybuilding, Arnold understood, wasn't just about muscle, it was about narrative, about convincing judges that you represented the ideal form. The competition at the Brooklyn Academy of Music was a disaster for Arnold. Oliva destroyed him, winning unanimously, his physique so superior that the judges barely deliberated. Arnold placed second, which by any reasonable standard was an achievement. He'd been in America less than a year, and had already become the sport's clear number 2. But Arnold didn't deal in reasonable standards. Second place was failure, and failure was unacceptable. Backstage after the show, while other competitors congratulated Oliva, Arnold stood alone, staring at his reflection in the mirror, cataloging every flaw, every area that needed improvement. The loss transformed Arnold's training. He became obsessed with his weaknesses, particularly his calves, which remained stubbornly small compared to the rest of his body. He began training calves every day, sometimes twice a day, performing hundreds of raises until he could barely walk. He cut the legs off all his training pants, forcing himself to confront his calves in the mirror during every workout, maintaining constant visual pressure on the lagging body part. The other Gold's members thought he'd lost his mind, but within a year, Arnold's calves had grown 3 inches. It was a testament to something beyond genetics or training science. It was pure, focused will, the same quality that had carried him from Thal to Munich to California. Money remained tight. The $100 per week from Weeder barely covered rent and food, leaving nothing for the life Arnold wanted to live. He took side jobs posing for art classes at UCLA, working construction, teaching bodybuilding seminars on weekends. The seminars were particularly lucrative. Gym owners would pay $50 or $100 for Arnold to appear, demonstrate exercises, and pose for photos. Arnold discovered he had a talent for public speaking, for entertaining a room, for making people believe that they too could transform themselves if they just worked hard enough. It was partially true and partially mythology, but Arnold sold it with conviction. In 1970, Franco Columbu arrived in California, having saved enough money to follow his friend to America. The reunion was joyous. The two Austrians, though Franco was technically Sardinian, Arnold lumped them together as fellow Europeans, rented a small apartment together, living in the cramped quarters with the ease of soldiers in a barracks. They trained together, ate together, and began scheming together about ways to make actual money. The solution came in the form of a business idea that was either brilliant or insane: a bricklaying and construction company called Pumping Bricks. The premise was simple: bodybuilders needed money, construction work was abundant in booming California, and wealthy homeowners would pay premium prices to have massive, muscular men laying bricks in their yards. Arnold and Franco recruited other Gold's Gym members, turning their physiques into marketing material. They printed flyers featuring photographs of themselves shirtless, holding trowels, with copy that read, "We lay bricks fast, and we lay them right. European craftsmanship, American efficiency." The business was surprisingly successful. Homeowners in Beverly Hills and Brentwood hired them as much for the spectacle as for the work. Here were Mr. Universe contestants building their patio, their muscles gleaming with sweat under the California sun. It was absurd and profitable, Exactly Arnold's kind of venture. The 1970 Mr. Olympia brought Arnold face to face with Oliva again, this time in New York's Town Hall. Arnold had added 20 pounds of muscle, refined his posing, and arrived with a psychological strategy. He began playing mind games with Oliva weeks before the competition, showing up at Oliva's gym in Chicago to train, complimenting Oliva's physique while subtly suggesting that Oliva looked smaller than last year. It was calculated psychological warfare, and Oliva, who was confident but not sophisticated in competitive gamesmanship, didn't know how to respond. The night before the competition, Arnold invited Oliva to dinner, insisting they were friends regardless of outcome, putting Oliva at ease. The next day, Arnold destroyed him. The judge's decision was controversial. Some observers thought Oliva should have repeated that Arnold's mass, while impressive, lacked Oliva's freaky genetics. But Arnold had won on presentation, on confidence, on the intangible quality of looking like a champion. At 23 years old, he became the youngest Mr. Olympia in history. The title came with prize money $1,500, barely enough to cover travel expenses, but it came with something far more valuable: legitimacy. Arnold was now, indisputably, the best bodybuilder in the world. The victory opened doors. Suddenly, Arnold wasn't just another muscle man, he was the muscle man, the one magazines wanted to feature, the one gyms wanted to host, the one supplement companies wanted to endorse. Weider increased his salary, then increased it again. Other companies approached Arnold with offers. He began saving money seriously for the first time in his life, depositing cash in a bank account that grew from hundreds to thousands. The American financial system was a revelation in Austria. Banks were where you kept money safe. In America, banks were where you made money grow. Arnold opened investment accounts, bought his first stocks, began thinking about wealth building with the same intensity he brought to muscle building. But bodybuilding, Arnold was realizing, had a ceiling. Even as champion, even with endorsements and seminars, the money topped out around $30,000 a year, comfortable but not transformative. He remembered Reg Park's second career in movies, remembered those Hercules films that had first inspired him. The path was obvious: use bodybuilding as a springboard to film, use muscle as an entry point to Hollywood, then transcend both. It was the same pattern Arnold had followed his entire life: dominate one arena, then move to a larger one. The problem was his accent, his name, and his body. Hollywood in 1970 had no template for Arnold Schwarzenegger. Casting directors told him his accent was too thick, his name unpronounceable, his physique too extreme. They suggested he change his name to something American. Arnold Strong was proposed. They suggested he take speech therapy to eliminate the Austrian inflection. They suggested he lose muscle mass to look more normal. Arnold refused every suggestion. He would make Hollywood accept him as he was, or he would create a category of film where his attributes were assets rather than liabilities. The first role came in 1970. Hercules in New York, a low-budget disaster where Arnold played the Greek god traveling to modern Manhattan. The film was awful. Arnold's dialogue was eventually dubbed by another actor because his accent was deemed incomprehensible, but it proved that someone, somewhere, would put him in a movie. It was a beginning, and Arnold had learned that beginnings, no matter how humble, were all that mattered. The rest was work, strategy, and refusal to accept limitations. He stood in California, the Mr. Olympia champion, a minor movie actor, a construction company owner, an immigrant who had conquered one American dream and was reaching for another. The boy from Thal was gone. The bodybuilder from Munich was evolving. What would emerge next was still being built, rep by rep, roll by roll, dollar by dollar. Part 4. The Transformation Machine, 1975 to 1985. By 1975, Arnold Schwarzenegger had become bodybuilding's dominant force, winning the Mr. Olympia title 6 consecutive times. But dominance, he was discovering, bred a peculiar kind of trap. He was the undisputed king of a kingdom most Americans didn't know existed. Outside the small world of muscle magazines and Gold's Gym, Arnold remained essentially unknown, a niche celebrity in a niche sport that generated minimal income and zero mainstream cultural relevance. At 28 years old, standing at the absolute peak of his bodybuilding career, Arnold made a decision that shocked the entire community. He retired from competitive bodybuilding. The announcement came after the 1975 Mr. Olympia in South Africa, a competition Arnold won despite being noticeably smaller than in previous years. He had been training less, focusing more on acting classes and auditions, and his body reflected the divided attention. Backstage, while other competitors discussed their training plans for next year, Arnold told Joe Weider he was done. "I've won everything," he said. "6 times is enough. I need to do something else." Weider was furious. Arnold was his prize asset, the face that sold magazines and supplements. But Arnold had already moved past negotiation. He was finished being the world's best bodybuilder. Now he wanted to become something the world actually cared about. The vehicle for his transformation arrived in the form of 2 filmmakers from New York, George Butler and Robert Fiore. They were producing a documentary about bodybuilding, following several athletes through the 1975 Mr. Olympia competition. The film, titled Pumping Iron, would be a low-budget cinema verite project, meant to demystify the strange subculture of competitive bodybuilding. But when Butler met Arnold, he recognized something that transcended the sport. Here was a natural performer, charismatic and articulate, someone who could carry a film not through acting skill but through sheer force of personality. Arnold understood immediately what Butler and Fiore were offering, a platform to reinvent himself for mainstream audiences. He agreed to come out of retirement for one final competition, the 1975 Mr. Olympia, specifically to be filmed. But more importantly, he shaped his portrayal in the documentary with calculating precision. The Arnold who appeared in Pumping Iron was a character, a carefully constructed persona that blended truth with mythology. He played himself as supremely confident, psychologically manipulative, willing to say outrageous things directly to camera. In one infamous scene, he compared the feeling of achieving a muscle pump to sexual orgasm. In another, he claimed to have skipped his father's funeral to train for a competition. The funeral story was a lie. Gustav Schwarzenegger had died in 1972. And Arnold had attended the service, but Arnold told it in the film because it reinforced the narrative he was building, that he was utterly committed, willing to sacrifice anything for success, a machine in human form. The Austrian accent, which he'd initially seen as a handicap, became part of the character. It made him sound foreign, almost alien, a visitor from a world where normal human emotions didn't apply. When Pumping Iron was released in 1977, it became an unexpected cultural phenomenon. Suddenly, bodybuilding was cool, or at least interesting, and Arnold was its spokesman. But cinematic success didn't immediately translate to acting work. Hollywood remained deeply skeptical. Casting directors saw Arnold's physique as a freak show, his accent as a career-ending liability. The few roles he landed were embarrassing: a cameo in The Long Goodbye, a supporting part in Stay Hungry, where he essentially played himself. His agents kept pushing him toward comedy, thinking his accent and size would work for laughs. Arnold resisted. He didn't want to be the joke, he wanted to be the hero. But heroes, in 1970s American cinema, looked like Al Pacino or Robert De Niro: compact, intense, ethnically ambiguous. They didn't look like 6'2" Austrian bodybuilders with unpronounceable surnames. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the Italian film industry. Dino De Laurentiis, the legendary producer behind films like Serpico and Death Wish, was developing Conan the Barbarian, based on Robert E. Howard's pulp fantasy stories from the 1930s. The character was a primitive warrior from a mythical age, strong, violent, and relatively silent. De Laurentiis needed someone who looked like they could actually wield a broadsword, someone whose physique suggested primal power. Arnold's agent submitted his name. De Laurentiis was initially dismissive. "I need a barbarian, not a bodybuilder," but agreed to a meeting. Arnold arrived at De Laurentiis's office in 1979 prepared like he was entering a competition. He had studied the Conan stories, memorized key passages, developed a vision for the character. When De Laurentiis expressed concern about Arnold's acting ability, Arnold responded with characteristic bluntness. "Conan doesn't talk much. He acts. I can act action." It was simultaneously absurd and perfect. De Laurentiis laughed, then considered seriously. The role required someone who looked like they'd been carved from stone. Arnold was carved from stone. He got the part. The preparation for Conan was brutal. The director, John Milius, wanted authenticity, or at least his version of it. Arnold spent months training with swords, learning to ride horses, studying martial arts choreography. The production shot in Spain, in locations chosen for their barren, primordial quality. The days were long, the conditions harsh, the work physically punishing. Arnold loved every minute. This was familiar territory, enduring discomfort in pursuit of transformation, pushing the body past its comfort zone. He had been preparing for this role, in a sense, since that first day in the Graz gym 20 years earlier. Conan the Barbarian was released in May 1982 and became an immediate commercial success, earning over $60 million domestically. Critics were divided. Some praised the film's visual grandeur and mythic tone, others dismissed it as fascist fantasy, but they unanimously agreed on one point: Arnold Schwarzenegger was a genuine screen presence. His limited dialogue became an asset. His physicality spoke volumes. The camera loved his proportions, the way his muscles caught light, the alien quality of his features. At 34 years old, Arnold had achieved what everyone said was impossible. He had become a movie star on his own terms, without changing his name, without losing the accent, without conforming to Hollywood's template. The money from Conan was substantial. Arnold earned $250,000, more than he made in his entire bodybuilding career. But more importantly, it proved marketability. Suddenly, studios were interested. The sequel, Conan the Destroyer, was greenlit immediately. Other projects emerged: action scripts, adventure films, roles that capitalized on Arnold's physicality while minimizing his acting limitations. Arnold was becoming a commodity, a brand, exactly what he'd intended. But the role that would truly transform Arnold's career came from an unlikely source: a low-budget science fiction script written by a young director named James Cameron. The Terminator was pitched as a B-movie, a chase thriller about a killer robot sent from the future. The budget was $6 million, modest by studio standards. Arnold was initially offered the role of Kyle Reese, the human hero. But when Arnold met with Cameron to discuss the project, he spent the entire meeting explaining why the Terminator character was more interesting: how a machine would move, how it would speak, how it would lack human emotional indicators. Cameron listened, then realized Arnold wasn't describing how to beat the Terminator. He was describing how to be the Terminator. Cameron rewrote the script with Arnold in mind. The Terminator would be the protagonist in terms of screen time, even though he was technically the villain. He would speak approximately 74 words in the entire film. He would move with mechanical precision, his face registering nothing resembling human empathy. It was a role that turned Arnold's perceived limitations into strengths. His accent sounded artificial, perfect for a machine. His size suggested inhuman power. His emotional blankness became terrifying rather than awkward. The shoot was low-budget chaos. Cameron was a perfectionist working with minimal resources, pushing cast and crew through 18-hour days. Arnold, accustomed to the discipline of bodybuilding, thrived in the austere conditions. He studied Cameron's vision obsessively, understanding that this film could either be a cult oddity or something culturally significant. The difference would come down to execution: how precisely the character was realized, how effectively the limited budget was deployed. The Terminator opened in October 1984 with minimal marketing and moderate expectations. Then something unexpected happened. It became a phenomenon. Audiences connected with the film's lean efficiency, its dark mythology, its vision of technology as existential threat. And Arnold's performance, mechanical, menacing, yet somehow charismatic, became iconic almost immediately. The line, "I'll be back," delivered in Arnold's Austrian monotone before he drives a car through a police station, entered the cultural lexicon. The image of Arnold in leather jacket and sunglasses, emerging from explosions with skeletal machinery visible beneath torn skin, became one of cinema's most recognizable visuals. The film earned over $78 million on its tiny budget, making it one of the most profitable films of 1984. Critics who had dismissed Arnold as a bodybuilder playing dress-up were forced to reconsider. This wasn't great acting in the traditional sense. Arnold wasn't disappearing into the role or revealing emotional depths. But it was perfect casting, perfect synthesis of performer and character. Arnold had found his niche, playing characters who were larger than human, operating on a scale where normal acting concerns didn't apply. Behind the commercial success, Arnold's personal life was undergoing equally dramatic transformation. In 1977, at a charity tennis tournament, he had met Maria Shriver, a journalist and member of America's most famous political dynasty, the Kennedy family. Maria was everything Arnold wasn't: East Coast establishment, Ivy League educated, born into wealth and political power. Their relationship was improbable: the Austrian bodybuilder and the Kennedy princess, but it worked precisely because of their differences. Maria was attracted to Arnold's drive, his immigrant hunger, his refusal to apologize for his ambitions. Arnold was attracted to Maria's sophistication, her family's political connections, and though he would never articulate it so crudely, her value as social capital. They dated for 9 years, navigating the complexities of two wildly different worlds. The Kennedy family was initially skeptical. Arnold was a Republican, a businessman, a bodybuilder, everything their liberal political tradition viewed with suspicion. But Arnold won them over through sheer charm and strategic patience. He learned their political language, attended their functions, demonstrated that beneath the muscles was a sharp political mind. He understood power, how it was accumulated and deployed, and the Kennedys respected that, even when they disagreed with his ideology. By 1985, Arnold Schwarzenegger stood at an inflection point. He was 38 years old, a legitimate movie star with The Terminator, launching him into the top tier of action heroes. He was wealthy, not just comfortable, but genuinely rich, with investments in real estate and business ventures generating income independent of his acting work. He was engaged to Maria Shriver, positioning himself within American aristocracy. The transformation was complete. The boy from Thal had become a global icon, a brand, a symbol of immigrant success. But Arnold wasn't satisfied. He never would be. Satisfaction was the enemy of progress, and Arnold had built his entire life on the principle that there was always another mountain to climb, another impossible goal to achieve. Hollywood was conquered. What came next would be politics, legacy, and the complications that arose when ambition finally collided with human limitation. Part 5: Empire and Entropy, 1985–present. The second half of the 1980s belonged to Arnold Schwarzenegger in a way that few actors have ever dominated popular culture. Following The Terminator's success, he became the most bankable action star on the planet, commanding salaries that escalated from hundreds of thousands to millions per film. Hollywood had finally figured out how to weaponize Arnold's unique attributes: his size, his accent, his essential foreignness, by casting him in roles where human vulnerability wasn't required. He became a genre unto himself, the Arnold movie, where physics bent to accommodate his presence, and plot existed mainly to connect spectacular action sequences. Commando arrived in 1985, a film so cartoonishly violent and absurd that it almost functioned as parody. Arnold played a retired Special Forces soldier who single-handedly invades a small country to rescue his kidnapped daughter, killing what appears to be several hundred people in the process. The body count was so extreme that critics accused the film of glorifying violence. Arnold's response was characteristically pragmatic. It's entertainment. If you want reality, watch the news. The film earned over $57 million, proving audiences wanted exactly what Arnold was selling: escape, power, fantasy, the vicarious thrill of watching an unstoppable force destroy everything in his path. But Arnold understood something his competitors didn't. The action hero market was finite and aging. He couldn't play the indestructible warrior forever. Eventually, time would make the spectacle look ridiculous rather than exciting. He needed to evolve, to demonstrate range, to prove he could sustain a career beyond physical spectacle. The solution came in the form of Predator, a 1987 science fiction thriller directed by John McTiernan. The film was ostensibly another action vehicle, Arnold leading a team of commandos through a Central American jungle, but it contained something darker, more psychologically complex than his previous work. The Predator itself was a brilliant narrative device, an alien hunter that systematically eliminated Arnold's team, reducing the unstoppable soldiers to terrified prey. For the first time in his film career, Arnold played vulnerability. His character was still heroic, still ultimately triumphant, but the film showed him bleeding, frightened, outmatched. It was a subtle but crucial shift, Arnold demonstrating he could carry dramatic weight, not just physical weight. The film was a massive success, earning nearly $100 million globally, and established Arnold as more than just a muscle-bound novelty. On April 26, 1986, Arnold married Maria Shriver in a ceremony that was part Hollywood spectacle, part political event. The wedding took place at St. Francis Xavier Church in Hyannis, Massachusetts, Kennedy Territory, with 600 guests including Andy Warhol, Oprah Winfrey, and virtually the entire Kennedy clan. Arnold's best man was Franco Columbu, the Sardinian bricklayer who had followed him to California decades earlier. The symbolism was perfect. Arnold had traveled from Thal to the Kennedy compound, from nobody to American royalty, and the wedding was proof that the journey was complete. The marriage was, by all contemporary accounts, a genuine partnership. Maria was fiercely intelligent, politically savvy, and unwilling to simply be the action star's wife. She maintained her journalism career, conducting high-profile interviews and reporting for NBC News. Their first child, Catherine, was born in 1989, followed by Christina, 1991, Patrick, 1993, and Christopher, 1997. Arnold embraced fatherhood with characteristic intensity, attending school events, coaching soccer teams, performing the domestic duties that seemed incongruous with his on-screen persona. The public loved the contradiction here was the Terminator changing diapers. But privately, Arnold was building an empire that extended far beyond acting. He had invested heavily in real estate since the 1970s, buying apartment buildings and commercial properties across Southern California. By the late 1980s, his real estate portfolio was generating millions annually, independent of his film income. He owned shopping centers, office buildings, and land that appreciated at rates that made even his massive movie salaries look modest. Arnold studied investment strategies with the same obsessive focus he'd brought to bodybuilding, reading financial journals, consulting with advisors, understanding that wealth came not from earning but from accumulating assets that generated passive income. The 1990s brought Arnold to the absolute peak of his commercial power. Total Recall, 1990, earned over $260 million worldwide. Terminator 2, Judgment Day, 1991, became the highest-grossing film of the year at over $500 million, with Arnold earning $15 million for reprising his most iconic role. True Lies, 1994, showcased Arnold in a James Cameron action comedy that earned over $370 million. At 47 years old, Arnold was earning $20 million per film, making him one of the highest-paid actors in Hollywood history. But the terrain was shifting. Younger action stars were emerging: Sylvester Stallone, Jean-Claude Van Damme, Wesley Snipes, and the market was fragmenting. Arnold recognized the threat and made a bold move. He pivoted to comedy. Twins, 1988, where Arnold played opposite Danny DeVito, was a gamble that paid off spectacularly. The film earned over $200 million, proving Arnold could succeed outside the action genre. Kindergarten Cop, 1990, and Junior, 1994, continued the trend Arnold playing against type, using his size and accent for humor rather than intimidation. The strategy worked commercially, but it also revealed Arnold's limitations as an actor. He was best when playing archetypal characters. Nuance remained elusive. The political ambitions that had simmered throughout Arnold's career began to surface more explicitly in the late 1990s. He had always been a Republican, drawn to the party's pro-business ideology and its narrative of individual achievement. In 2003, California Governor Gray Davis faced a recall election, a bizarre political mechanism that allowed voters to remove a sitting governor mid-term. The recall created a circus atmosphere. 135 candidates filed to run, including actors, porn stars, and political gadflies. Arnold announced his candidacy on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno, treating the campaign launch as a movie premiere. The political establishment dismissed Arnold as a celebrity dilettante, someone who understood cameras but not governance. They underestimated him catastrophically. Arnold ran a campaign that blended entertainment and substance, using his celebrity to generate media coverage while surrounding himself with serious policy advisors. He advocated for fiscal conservatism, environmental protection, and education reform, positions designed to appeal beyond traditional Republican bases. The Kennedy connection helped with Democrats. The business success appealed to independents. On October 7, 2003, Arnold won the recall election with 48.6% of the vote, becoming the 38th governor of California. The governorship revealed both Arnold's strengths and limitations as a political figure. He approached the role with genuine seriousness, working 100-hour weeks, mastering policy details, negotiating with the Democratic-controlled legislature. He achieved notable successes: infrastructure bonds to rebuild California's crumbling roads and schools, environmental legislation that put California ahead of federal standards on emissions, workers' compensation reform that saved the state billions. But he also faced intractable problems: budget deficits, partisan gridlock, economic recession that couldn't be solved through willpower and charisma alone. Arnold served 2 terms as governor, leaving office in January 2011 with approval ratings around 23%, a steep fall from the initial honeymoon period. The Great Recession had devastated California's finances, and Arnold's attempts at fiscal reform had alienated both parties. But the political failure was soon overshadowed by a personal catastrophe that destroyed everything Arnold had built in his private life. In May 2011, the Los Angeles Times broke a story that Arnold had fathered a child with Mildred Patricia Baena, a member of the household staff who had worked for the Schwarzenegger family for 20 years. The child, Joseph, had been born in 1997, just days after Maria gave birth to Christopher. Arnold had supported the child financially but had kept the affair and its consequence secret for 14 years. Maria had discovered the truth earlier that year, confronting Arnold and immediately separating from him. The revelation was devastating on multiple levels. It wasn't just the affair. Hollywood was familiar with sexual infidelity among powerful men. It was the duration of the deception, the proximity of the betrayal. The child had been conceived in the family home while Maria was pregnant, and the moral hypocrisy of a man who had campaigned on family values. Maria filed for divorce, though the proceedings would take a decade to finalize. The Kennedy family, already familiar with scandal, closed ranks around Maria. Arnold's public image, carefully constructed over 4 decades, collapsed in weeks. Arnold retreated from public life, issuing apologies that rang hollow given the scale of the betrayal. He attempted to return to acting, appearing in The Expendables series and reviving the Terminator franchise, but the magic was gone. Audiences had moved on, and Arnold at 65 couldn't convincingly play the indestructible warrior. His films opened to diminishing returns. The entertainment industry, which had celebrated his rise, now viewed him as a cautionary tale, a symbol of ego unchecked, ambition without moral constraint. Yet Arnold's story resists simple moral conclusions. By 2023, at 76 years old, he had achieved a kind of cultural rehabilitation. His environmental activism earned respect from progressive circles. His bodybuilding legacy remained untouchable. He had transformed the sport from fringe pursuit to mainstream fitness culture. His business acumen had made him genuinely wealthy, with a net worth exceeding $400 million. He had become a grandfather, maintaining relationships with all his children, including Joseph. The divorce from Maria was finally settled in 2021, allowing both to move forward. Arnold published a memoir in 2012. Total Recall: My Unbelievably True Life Story, where he acknowledged his failures while refusing to apologize for his ambition. The book's tone was quintessentially Arnold, unapologetic about his drive, regretful about the costs, but fundamentally, perhaps Arnold's greatest achievement was this: he made himself matter in a country that had no use for him when he arrived. He forced America to accept him on his terms, to change its definitions of success and celebrity to accommodate his specific attributes. The accent that should have ended his career became his trademark. The body that seemed grotesque became aspirational. The name that was unpronounceable became globally recognized. Arnold Schwarzenegger